One magical question is this: which life cycle of the protests in Iran am I supporting? Protests in different countries have different life cycles. It is often the case that a protest is sparked out of genuine dissatisfaction at the present state or an injustice. This is similar to any other country. George Floyd can be a recent example. Now, for Iranians outside of Iran, this brings signs of hope for regime change, a legitimate demand because they presume that with this change, we get to have this ultimate final dream of the do-over that we've always yearned for. But then literally in the course of a few days, the protests enter a different life cycle. This life cycle has some particular people and agents. We have ordinary Iranian citizens who live abroad and are genuinely frustrated and upset and angry at the injustice. They march in protests and do interviews with the press here and there. But we also have very specific organizations, I call them funded opposition, and lobbies of the adversaries of the Iranian government who enter the sphere of this commotion and do everything to get out of it what they want, be it a justification of further sanctions or a call to topple the regime. Let us not forget, when ordinary Iranians want to topple the regime, they're aiming for something other than what the MEK wants. MEK was a formerly designated terrorist organization and is a cult-like Iranian opposition group. What an ordinary Iranian wants is different from what a lobby who has close ties to, let's say, Saudi Arabia wants. The latter wants to assume power or weaken the power on the ground, while an Iranian wants a legitimate do-over. So then you can imagine how messy this life cycle of protests are. Iranians are angry, so they don't want to hear about the co-optation and hijacking of the protests, or the trajectories that the funded opposition wants to take them. And then you can imagine the riled up feelings here. You can imagine that in order to win this cycle and co-opt this resistance, how many voices of Iranians who are opposed to this co-optation get smeared, silenced, and how many Iranians get threatened in order for a hegemonic narrative of change, like sanctions, to be sustained. And then we have a third phase. This is the tragic phase, when not only the demands of the people are ignored, but we also end up with global policies of further isolating the Iranian people. This phase is literally the death of the first cycle of protests, because we allowed ourselves to be duped by the second cycle. So the magical question I provided earlier allows the first cycle of the protests to live and thrive. An awareness of these different life cycles often manifests itself in calling on your governments to stay away from meddling in the internal affairs of a nation who is already suffering from extreme authoritarianism on the ground. This way, you can also be aware not to endorse the voices of funded opposition and can be able to discern ethical stances on protests from unethical ones. To be able to differentiate this is actually easy. One way is to see what different people or politicians are calling for. Imagine your fellow countryman or parliament member calling for sanctions or maximum pressure policies for Iran, and if that very same person does not endorse an equal amount of pressure on another country who has the same or even worse record of human rights abuses, then be skeptical and think, hold on a second, which life cycle of resistance and protests is this right now? I always say countries who do not have their resources nationalized do not get sanctioned because of human rights abuses. This magic question also helps you not fall into the trap that sees sanctions as liberatory or as aiding the protesters. Sanctions are often by definition infliction of pain on others so they would change their behavior about something that the sanctioner doesn't like. And it usually is not about inflicting pain on governments so they would change their behavior towards their own people. Even though it's presented that way, it shouldn't dupe us. Funny how Canada recently sanctioned 2 members who were actually amongst the critics of what happened in Iran. So there's a lot to unpack here. Always ask, do I want my government, trade, medicine, travel, businesses be sanctioned because it does horrific stuff? If the answer is no, then don't want it for another country. You can never achieve democracy through sanctions. Ask North Korean people or the Libyans. The magic question also helps us dig a bit deeper. Oftentimes, mainstream opposition is filled with activists who do not disclose their affiliations with lobbied opposition, but their affiliations are easily available online. Some are smart in hiding their affiliations, but check them, it will go a long way. This does not mean you should rely on misinformation or the smear points or the smear campaigns. I mean the actual professional affiliations. It absolutely can. Let me give you 2 examples of the consequences of us not knowing or not caring about which life cycle we're supporting. One example can be from one of my earlier talks. It is at a press conference at the Canadian Parliament a few years ago. In the press conference, there's a woman that followed an activist in exile and her call for wearing white scarves on Wednesdays to protest the unjust law of mandatory headscarves. This woman was arrested because she removed her scarf and put it on a stick, following a few other protesters protesting the same way. The activist went to jail in Iran on charges of organized disruption, eventually came to Canada and got hired as a senior fellow in an institute called Raoul Wallenberg. So imagine we're at the press conference. The activist recounts what happened to her. The press conference is held by a few parliament members who are calling for imposing sanctions on Iran on human rights grounds. The speech ends, and there comes the time for the journalists to start asking their questions. We hear the voice of a correspondent, a woman called Tanda, who, with a worried tone, asks, "My question is to your guest. I'm just curious if you feel that if Canada were to act on this kind of thing, what impact would that practically have on the people you're advocating?" It's a difficult question, and it is right on point. The activist steps towards the podium again to answer the question. If you watch the video, there's a 3-second pause, and there's a subtle but true discomfort that can be sensed amongst the army of sanctioneers, I call them, in the back who are holding the press conference. The activist sighs and shrugs her shoulders as she struggles to find an answer. It is quite a troubling and poignant moment. She says, "I guess it would put pressure on the Iranian government to have simply justice in our courtrooms and release the activists and lawyers. They're not criminals. I guess targeting those judges, those architects of repression, as Professor mentioned, it may help the prisoners. It may put some pressure on government." The reporter insists, "Wouldn't they be treated worse?" The answer culminates in the bleakest position that one can imagine for their activism. "I don't think so. I hope it helps them," justifying the severing of diplomatic ties with Iran on this premise. "I hope it helps them." The professor, the parliament member, and the international chair of Raoul Wallenberg Institute rushes to the podium to ameliorate the activist's response. He rightly notices that the answer, "I hope it helps them," is not good enough for the implementation of sanctions. He starts reading an almost irrelevant piece of information from a pamphlet he uses as a reference. It's called Architects of Repression. He reads a passage from the pamphlet on the potential chances of harassment and assassination of people in Canada by an Iranian member of the government. He then looks into the eyes of the reporter as if he's trying to seek assurance that the strong claim worked out as a charm that would divert attentions away from the activist's ambivalent answer. The pamphlet is written by a think tank group called FDD and forwarded by the professor himself. FDD is an organization that is a pro-Israel think tank that spearheaded the attack on the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and according to an article written in 2015, FDD's experts testified 17 times before Congress in opposition to the then interim and now almost cancelled agreement. So here we have very specific organizations, I call them funded opposition, and lobbies of adversaries of the Iranian government who enter, hijack, and pervert the uprisings and do everything to get out of it what they want, be it a justification of further sanctioning or a call to topple the regime. This is no longer the first cycle, and we're not dealing with an authentic protest, and our defending of it is therefore unethical. This is the second life cycle. So, if we support this life cycle, we're no longer supporting ordinary Iranian citizens who live abroad and are genuinely frustrated and upset and angry at the injustice.
این تحریم‌های اقتصادی مثل شیمی درمانی میمونه، به خاطر اینکه به همون قدری که هدفش اینه که به سرطان رو نابود کنه، صدمه میرسونه به بقیه، 100% صدمه میرسونه به بقیه بدن. این جریان خیلی پیچیده تره از اینی که بگیم تحریم خوبه یا بده.
Even if they themselves think sanctions are right, it is our responsibility to ask ourselves questions similar to the one Tanda, the reporter, asked. So this was an example from a few years ago, but we have a pretty recent example. The Berlin demonstration a few weeks ago. This is a pretty curious case for me personally, because the people who advocated for it, and at least one of the keynote speakers, were in particular ways connected to the professor in the previous example. The protest was huge. Many people attended it, and there were two interesting points. A group called Women Life Freedom, created in September 2022, hosted the event. According to the BBC, their demands were more sanctions and expelling of Iranian diplomats out of Western capitals. This means reducing diplomatic ties, which according to international law experts can be a delegitimizing step which can aid the invasion of a country, and it can trigger or aid a preludial attempt towards invading a country. The government of Germany's reaction is interesting in and of itself after this protest. They denounced the violence and expressed solidarity with the protesters. We had a lot of symbolic haircut moments in different European parliaments like Belgium and Sweden. Within a few days, Lufthansa announced it will be cancelling flights to and from Iran. And Germany announced how issuing visas will become more difficult. The German MPs also recently urged the German government to maintain the already increased political and diplomatic pressure on the regime in Tehran, meaning the continuation of sanctions. I like the Berlin case because it was brilliant in duping us and co-opting our authentic anger. Here, we're not dealing with an innocent support of the first phase of the protests. We are in the second and, in fact, third life cycles. Germany and the sanctioners' call are, in fact, prime examples of pinkwashing in a broader context, the justification of prescribing and paving the way for more sanctions and suffering under the name of objecting to women's suffering. How can the question help us? This magic question will equip us with other questions like, how did we get from the death of a protester to paving the way for invading a country? Or why did this not happen after George Floyd? How careful should we be about which life cycle we're supporting in geographies that are targets of expansionism for various reasons? Yes, it can, and they're great examples of these healthy stances. Ireland's reaction is one. Ireland has a history of being the target of expansionism itself, so this awareness comes at a price. Claire Daly, member of the EU Parliament, recently said, Iranians must be able to push for social change without shocking violence and repression from their authorities. They should also be free from attempts from the West to co-opt their struggle against their own interests. It is for Iranians to decide their future, no one else. Now, this stance does not only endorse and foreground the importance of paying attention to the first cycle of the protests, it also literally calls out the corrupt intentions of the second and third cycles. Et voila, this is my response to whether there exists one magical question that can help us with understanding the protests. Keep asking yourself, which life cycle of the protests am I supporting?